topic is the 19th century. I would argue that the 19th century is more than just a century between the 18th and 20th. It is a century all its own, and a very interesting one in its own right. It is, perhaps most importantly for this class, the golden age of migration. Not only, as we learned yesterday, did 55 million Europeans leave for the US, for Canada, for various countries in Latin America as well as Oceania, there's also considerable migration westward across the North American continent. There's a lot of people in motion. I'll have some numbers later in the lecture that I think will impress upon you that the magnitude of the migration in the 19th century is, relative to populations, far greater than its magnitude in the 20th century, which is still, as we know, quite significant so far in the 21st century. A lot of people left, and part of that was partially made possible by a rapid population growth that we'll also talk about. But before we get to the facts, I want to make some broad, sweeping generalizations about the 19th century, which I think are useful to keep in mind as we plod through it these next few weeks. The 19th century was an age where man's place in the universe got smaller, declined, and became less important in a big sense. For example, it's the century where Darwin writes, and humans lose a certain amount of their specialness because they become just other creatures in a system that is not so clearly regulated by God for man's interest. But at the same time, man's place in the world rises, and rises quite dramatically. What I mean here is that there's an industrial revolution. And so people in this period of time are going to relate to nature in a different way. And the power of humans over the other things in the world dramatically rise. We'll have canals, we'll have railroads, we'll have telegraphs, we'll have elevators and skyscrapers and bridges, we'll have iron, we'll have steel, all sorts of things. By the end of the 19th century, the frontier will be declared closed, and cities will become once and for all the dominant place where people live. Cities will become the focus of real power in most of the West. It's also an age of optimism in an interesting way. First, the 19th century sees kind of the culmination of the Enlightenment and Enlightenment ideas. Two in particular are important. Monarchy takes a lot of blows. It's not quite dead by the end of the 19th century, but it's pretty close. The beginning of the century, monarchy is the dominant form of government. By the beginning of the 20th century, it's very clearly in decline in favor of more representative forms of government, very much along Enlightenment ideas. Also very much along Enlightenment ideas, slavery finally comes to an end after being present for the entire span of human history as far as we know. It ends fairly easily for Britain, who bans it in 1833 without major wars. It ends very painfully for the United States in 1863, and it ends finally in Brazil in 1885. But nonetheless, by the end of the century, slavery is over. And those are two big, I think, very big triumphs for the Enlightenment. Also, along these lines of Enlightenment optimism, was a very strong belief in the power of reason and the power of science. As I was saying, the Industrial Revolution is very much taking off in this period, and people are, at this point, not so focused on what we now know to be its detrimental effects. The Industrial Revolution is kind of the fruition of the scientific revolution of earlier periods. People have been seeing, since really the 1600s, there's been a big growth in human knowledge, but it's really the 19th century when this knowledge is really applied, and it's an age of tremendous inventiveness, lots and lots of new things that really raise the standard of living, and that increase in the standard of living makes people happy, and they associate that with the triumph of science. It's when we contrast to the 20th century, it's really quite substantial. I mean, we all have our moments of optimism about how cool the iPhone is and so forth, but the 20th century really casts a lot of doubt on this stuff, and particularly in World War I, which is often considered to be the end of the 19th century, when Europeans really commit carnage on a tremendous scale. But up until that sort of loss of innocence, the 19th century is really very much optimistic, and happy time. It's a simpler time, should we say. We'll talk about the 20th century when we get to it. But so I just want to make those points. This is a period again where humans are very, very triumphant, and I think this follows very nicely with, this is very consonant with Americans, the way Americans feel about America as well. Okay. So the main points, less of the lecture today, are that the 19th century saw industrialization, urbanization, and migration on a scale never before seen. I will talk about the demographic transition as both a cause and an effect of these trends. The demographic transition is one of the key ideas of demography, so we really can't have a demography class without it. But I'm also going to argue that economics and demography alone don't quite explain everything. And the way I'll do this is we'll characterize this migration in terms of several observable factoids, and then we'll partially explain them with demographic transition, we'll partially explain them with economics. And by economics, I mean here self-interest, really. We'll see how much we can explain, and we'll agree at the end to kind of punt. We can get some understanding of it, but in the end, it's complicated, and we really don't have complete explanations for all the various interesting features of human migration or of migration that took place in the 19th century. So questions about any of that so far? All right. I shall say that at the end of class, we will give back the grades on Lab 1. We will do that. I think there's no class in here, so we'll hang out, but I'll try to end a few minutes early so we can do that. All right. So first we'll talk about 19th century changes, then we'll cover these migration factoids that I talked about, talk then about the demographic transition and how much of those factoids we can explain by it, and we'll talk about migration in relation, I said how much we can explain of migration from the demographic transition. Okay. So first, I sort of alluded to some of these things, but I think it's worth taking a look at a very incomplete list of all the things that happened in the 19th century. Most of these, I think all of these, we could put the word revolution in front of it if we wanted. We could call fossil fuel the energy revolution if you want. It's a big change. Prior to the 19th century, the really only sources of energy were human power and animal power. You could use some wind for some things, like that ship on the cover of this lecture. You could also use water, but not much of that was done. It was really largely humans and animals. But in the 19th century, petroleum, coal, steam, from petroleum and coal, and later in the century, electricity, revolutionized things. This puts humans in very much a more powerful position than they were in before. They now do things that they couldn't have imagined without petroleum, for example. Transportation revolution. The Erie Canal is finished in 1825, and that is a huge engineering feat. It connects the Hudson River with Lake Erie, and thereby connecting the East with the Midwest. And that figures heavily in how people who live in the Midwest are going to interact with markets, and I'll talk about that later. But again, the costs of shipping things start to fall at internet-like pace, because after we have canals, then they put steamships on canals, and there's canals and railroads, and canals and rivers, and steamships can go all the way from New York to New Orleans. Railroads come along later, and then the elevator seems like a trivial thing, but it allows you to build tall buildings. And internal combustion engine is very late in the century; it's not terribly important. But the tremendous fall in the cost of transportation means, as we'll see, that all over the world, people are more connected economically. And the actions of markets in one place, say for example the United States, have a bigger effect than they would have before on Europeans, for example. Same thing can be said about communication. Telegraph, it's 1866, there's a transatlantic telegraph line. Photography, typewriters, phonographs. Telephone is really a 20th century item, but once again, these are big changes. In agriculture, we don't always think of, there's also an industrial revolution. A large number of new machines, and of course, steam engines are replacing beasts of burden. Barbed wire, refrigeration, another thing we don't often think about, but also has a tremendous effect because it allows crops grown in places far from markets to survive the transportation. Thus, it's tying the world, tying the U.S. together. So, fossil fuels, transportation, communication, agriculture, materials, once again, rubber and steel, neither of these were invented in the 19th century, but both of them became feasible to produce on a commercial scale and were useful. Machine guns, dynamite, torpedoes, smokeless gunpowder, these are some of the things that will make the Civil War a tremendously disruptive enterprise by the standards of war of the time, and will make World War I an unspeakable carnage. Last on my list here is medicine. And this, I think, is somewhat of a surprise to many people. Well, maybe not if you really think about the words 19th century medicine. I guess it's not that big a surprise. There really wasn't. The advances in medicine were not as great as in many of the other areas. Ether and chloroform were first used in the 1840s and 1850s. And this was certainly a big advance, but, look who, that means you're having surgery, which is kind of an icky thought. That's really what they know how to do. But germ theory really doesn't have a big impact. It's very late in the century that Pasteur and Koch finally convinced the world that the germs really are the carriers of disease. And that alone should tell us a lot about why 19th century medicine is not really advancing terribly fast. I point that out because I'm going to make an argument that mortality fell a great deal in the 19th century. And this is one of the arguments has been, it's slightly controversial, what role medicine played in it. I think most demographers now think that it didn't play a very big role. And I think that's why. Right. But I'm getting ahead of myself and behind myself too. I mentioned that in addition to immigration, the U.S. also saw a great deal of migration. And what made that possible in the 19th century was that during the 19th century, the U.S. gained a whole lot of territory. I want to march through it fairly quickly here. We will. This is one of the details that we don't have a lot of. We don't have really enough time to cover in great detail. But 1803 is the Louisiana Purchase. It was under the Jefferson administration, and it is very much consonant with Jefferson's vision of a country full of farmers. It made a lot of sense to him to own all this land. So much sense that he was willing to overlook his principles and buy it as president, even though the Constitution did not give him the authority to do it. As you recall, the Democratic Republicans were very concerned about tyranny and about the Constitution being strictly interpreted. After 1803, Texas is annexed in 1845. That triggers the Mexican-American War in 1846, which results in the Mexican Cession in 1848, which includes California, where gold is discovered in 1849. Talking about a lucky country. And also, by negotiation with Britain, the Oregon Territory falls into the United States' hands in 1848 as well. And there are a few other miscellaneous pieces. Florida in 1819, title established, negotiated later on up in North Minnesota, and a Gadsden Purchase below. But the point is that really by 1848, about the middle of the century, the United States is kind of put together the way we think of it today, minus Alaska and Hawaii, but it spans the continent and thus make possible all the western migration and all the immigration that the United States is going to absorb during this century. And as I said, it absorbs quite a lot. 33 million people, of which perhaps a third return home, is a very large number, quite a bit larger to the U.S. population, if you want to think of it, than was the 55 million who left Europe compared to Europe's population. What I mean by that is that in 1900, the U.S. population was about 5 million. So over the century, adding 33 million is large. At the end of the century, the U.S. population was 76 million. You can't simply say that, roughly a third of it was immigration, because immigrants came all through the period and they had children and so on. But nonetheless, just look at those numbers. You've got a country that starts with 5 million, ends with 76 million, and during that period, 33 million people come. It's a lot. Europe, on the other hand, starts out at about 190 million, ends at about 400 million. So Europe is growing at quite a clip as well, even though 55 million people leave. As we'll see in a moment reasons for this, but this is definitely a period of rapid migration. But that migration has obviously very, very considerable impact on the U.S. Oops, there we go. If we put some of this together, some of the facts that we just talked about, there are a couple of cycles that we can kind of begin to think about. For example, transportation and communication revolution plus agricultural improvements, later refrigeration. What that means is that the U.S. now has farms everywhere. Right? Before trains and before canals and before riverboats, you couldn't really grow much in Missouri, for example. If you're in 1810 or something, you're growing stuff in Kentucky or anything east of the Appalachian, you're probably going to have to ship it down the Mississippi through France, because French are in control here. You have very little contact with the East. Most likely you're going to be a subsistence farmer. Now, with transportation, with these new agricultural improvements and all of this new land, what happens is, of course, the farms are everywhere, and agricultural prices start to fall. Right? They fall because supply rises. Even though we're seeing this huge population increase, look at all this new land that's going into cultivation. And man, you can grow a lot in Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, Missouri. So what happens then is this combination of transportation, communication, agricultural improvements leading to more farms, leading to falling agricultural prices, makes farming conditions worse in Europe. We'll talk a little more about that next week. But as the price falls, because land is cheap and technology is improving, European peasants are now in worse shape than they were. Every time the price falls, it becomes harder to make a living as a farmer in Europe. Well, what happens then is that more farmers from Europe then flood into the United States and build more farms, grow more agricultural produce, and drive the price even further down. Okay? So that's one kind of a cycle. Another kind of cycle that each farmer is caught in is the falling agricultural prices. This mechanization, along with a world market price, right, because of communication and transportation and so on, the price falls and the technology improves. What this means is a farmer needs to buy all this new machinery in order to sell, or to grow wheat or corn, sell in a world market. Got to buy all this machinery. That means he's got new kinds of relationships with new kinds of markets. He's got mortgages, he's got debts. Farming becomes more complicated and more integrated, and thus more susceptible to business cycles and so on. And as that happens, we'll get people who are on the farms leave for cities. And so this is another big trend, is a rural to urban migration, not simply from rural areas in the United States to urban areas in the United States, although that's certainly part of it, but also from rural areas in Europe to urban areas in the United States. A lot of the migration, more and more so as the century progresses, is of this kind, rural to urban. Right? And finally, let's put together the transportation revolution plus immigration plus a whole lot of economic changes. That is the need to deal with new kinds of markets. And I think what you get is angst. You get people who are made uncomfortable by a lot of change. People are no longer living as close as they were to their families. The people whom they live nearby are more likely to be immigrants. They are less in control of their lives because, well, all this new gadgetry is great stuff. It also imposes restrictions. And what I think you get from that, along with other factors, is the Second Great Awakening. This is another big trend in the 19th century, especially the early 19th century, which is a big upwelling of religious fervor, and of a very different kind than what we saw before. Also consonant with what I said about the 19th century, about man's place in the world rising. Even though Darwin has reduced man's place in the universe, the new religious theology, the new Protestant doctrines of the Second Great Awakening are very different from the Puritan ones that we talked about, where there's a great emphasis on irredeemable sin. In the 19th century, much more common is the idea of perfectibility. The idea that humans can actually cast off sin, can live without sin, and that it's their duty to do so. That's a big deal because of the way it feeds into the debate over abolition. Slavery is a sin, and where in previous times sin was more tolerated, now humans can be perfected. We must do away with sin. Same thing goes for temperance, the movement against alcohol, which also grows in the 19th century. Okay? So a lot of these changes, I'm saying that there's not only a lot of changes, but they kind of support each other. A lot of changes that give kind of positive feedback and cause other things to happen, which then support the original changes. Okay, let's turn then to the factoids, to a couple of factoids that are in search of an explanation. The argument here is that if you look at Daniels, the beginning of Daniels, where he talks about Ravenstein's laws as a kind of reasonable stab at why people migrate, they're very micro-focused. They really come down to people move because they see it as in their self-interest to do so. Right? Remember Ravenstein's laws? He's got the push and the pull and the means. It's simple enough that it can't really be wrong. But I think there are things that individual self-interest alone can't quite explain. I think these are some of them. There's overlap. As I say, some of these clearly individual motivations have a role, but there's something going on, argue, that's more than the sum of people's individual behaviors. And one of them is this emigration cycle. Right? If you look at this graph, this is a graph of thousands of immigrants from different countries over a couple of centuries. And I want you to sort of half close your eyes and look at the yellow bars. Right? These are Germans, Germany. And you see it rise a little, okay, ignore the spike, and then it sort of comes down. Right? It rises and then it falls. Look at another country, say Ireland, that's the green one. It rises and then it largely falls again. Happy times in the 1880s, but still, overall, it's falling. Same story with Italy, although it's much shorter. You'll see it. It rises very quickly and falls very quickly. But then as we get to the 20th century, for reasons that we'll go into when we get to the 20th century, that pattern is less obvious. Right? The reason is that there are lots of laws passed in the 19th century. So this is much more regulated. In the 19th century, there's not so much regulation. So these are more, in a sense, more naturally the result of forces, economic and psychological. So I'm arguing that if you're in a generous mood, you might agree, based on this graph, that immigration follows this sort of pattern. An introductory phase where migration starts, a growth phase, it can be fairly steep, followed by a saturation phase, if you like, and then a regression phase, which are just big words for it's bell-shaped. It goes up, and then it comes down. It doesn't just go up and stay there. And there are still people in England, but very few of them are migrating to the United States now. We'll see. This is simply a stylized fact. Right? It's not